Well, folks, this is it, the final nail on the coffin on the Frosty the Snowman franchise. And I'm, of course, referring to The Legend of Frosty the Snowman, which was released direct-to-video on October 18th, 2005, and it was directed by Greg Sullivan, written by Emily Kapnick, produced by Evan Bailey and Kathy Antonson Rocchio, with music by Jared Faber, and it stars the voices of Burt Reynolds, Bill Fagerback, Kath Soucie, Jeannie Elias, Gray Delisle, Tara Strong, Vernie Watson-Johnson, Ken Michael, David Jeremiah, Larry Miller, Tom Kenny, and Evan Gore, and Candy Milo. Now, I had no idea what I was going to get myself into with this final nail on the coffin, because I've managed to hear a lot of crappy things about this final sequel. In fact, I would have to say that after watching this, I just really couldn't stand this film in its entirety. It basically felt so lifeless and so dull and, at worst, even very annoying and obnoxious that at that point I felt like it had to be reviewed regardless of how bad it was. So let's start, shall we? Beginning with the story. Now, in terms of it being part of the whole Frosty the Snowman franchise, I felt like it had no right to, especially with this movie's version of the origin story. Whatever happened to the likes of Karen, who discovered that the hat of Professor Hinkle was the one that turned Frosty into life? Whatever happened to that? Instead, we get another backstory of this kid's and his older brother's father being the bearer of the original hat, because his father was a magician as well. So, in terms of it being connected to the original Frosty the Snowman, I felt like it had no right to. I felt like it should have also tied up some ends with the original Frosty story and called it a day. But what did it do? I felt like the people behind this film just didn't even bother watching the original and just managed to do what the hell they want. The worst part is Emily Kapnick was one of the writers here. Heck, she was even the head writer. She was the spearheader of one of my most favorite yet mercilessly underrated Nicktoons of all time, as told by Ginger. So what was she doing writing this thing? Was she desperate for a paycheck? It's like, with this thing, I felt nothing. I felt like it didn't deserve to be called Frosty the Snowman. I felt like everything just left me bored. It just felt tired. It just felt all uninteresting. And it's supposed to be Frosty the Snowman, the very thing that really is supposed to be lighthearted and joyful, not dull, uninteresting, and forced. In fact, there's just a lot of things wrong with the story. We have a regular family, in which the father is like the mayor of the town for some reason. And then we get kids connecting with the other kids as to what this whole story of Frosty the Snowman is. But the problem with the story is that it's so disjointed. We focus on one character, and then we focus our attention to the other, and it just seems really, really all over the place. Even the character development is so over the place, which I'll get to the characters later. So, in essence, the story was all over the place. It was boring. It was uninteresting. I really didn't feel for anyone at all. I didn't even care for anything that's happened, and I just found myself literally annoyed. So, the story was just lifeless. Nothing more to say about it. Then we get to the animation, which is relatively decent. I mean, it's nice and colorful and looks pretty nice, and the character designs are rather cool as well. But it's not to say that it doesn't really stand out that much. I mean, it's still nice to look at, but I just didn't really care. And then we get the music, which is also okay, but nothing to write home about. But with Burt Reynolds singing Frosty the Snowman, I felt like it lacked energy in how he sang it. It lacked Jimmy Durant's, well, charm and uniqueness to the song. And instead, with Burt Reynolds singing it, I just kind of felt sorry for the guy. We probably could have had more upbeat singer singing Frosty the Snowman, and we could have called it a day. And then we get to the characters, and oh god, these characters are, well, let's just say that they're okay at best, annoying at almost worst, but almost just forgettable and even bland and uninteresting at worst, and just plain stupid and annoying. First of all, there was nothing interesting about Tommy. There was nothing interesting about him. He was just your everyday kid character who seemed like he could do no wrong, and, well, that's just it. He's just there. His older brother Charlie is no better. I mean, he's just your stereotypical older brother who's pretty much of a bully towards him sometimes, and tends to really think that, oh, just because he's the older brother, that means he can be able to push him around. But what I don't get is his character development. How does he turn into, like, from the bully to give a complete 180 to be, like, a friend to, well, Tommy's best friend after witnessing Frosty the Snowman? How does he do that? It makes no sense. Especially after they got detention, it absolutely makes no sense. I found myself scratching my head wondering, how did that happen? How on earth did that happen? It just makes little to no sense. Sarah is just your typical independent girl who's so sick and tired of being treated like a doll, treated like a little girl, and she wants to be a lot more free to do what she wants to do and not what her mom expects her to do. And then we get the triplets, namely Simon, Sunny, and Sully. They are completely forgettable, and I have to say one thing. If they would have been cut from the film, then nothing would change. They contribute absolutely nothing to the plot other than just to help Tommy, Charlie, Walter, and Sarah, and even Frosty save the day. And speaking of Walter, he's just your typical nerd kid. That's just it. But when he meets Frosty, he kind of has a little bit of a change in personality, and, well, it's okay and all, but ultimately I just don't really care about him. Not to mention the main villain, Principal Pankley. He's just pretty stupid in his motivations. I didn't really care about this guy. I didn't feel intrigued by him. Heck, I don't even feel intimidated by him. He's just stupid and annoying. And then we get Mr. Tinkleton, who is just totally forgettable. He is pretty much your typical strict dad who loves rules, who loves to be the macho man in the house, who loves to have order in his house, and loves being the freaking king. Nothing more to say about him, but sometimes he really gets on my nerves. And not to mention his whole past about his previous encounters of Frosty the Snowman. It's like, man. And another problem with the story as well. There's this whole plot of a comic that also showed that Tommy's dad was also once upon a time encountering Frosty the Snowman after his father was like having a lousy job as a magician, and somehow the comic book turns into like a guidebook to how Tommy has to fulfill some prophecy. I felt like that was just rather bullshit. But with going to Mr. Tinkerton, I just didn't care about him. He just didn't really grow on me. Instead, he just really grated on me. And then his wife isn't any better. She tries to be the supportive one, but she just comes off as annoying and grating. The teacher, Miss Sharpie, was annoying. There's nothing to her anyway. The parents, well, the other parents don't really have any personality to speak of other than they're just the parents. That's just it. So overall, the cast of characters, well, I really did not grow to like them nor care about them. They're just there. But this is also Frosty's show, right? So he should redeem it. Unfortunately, Frosty just comes off as annoying with barely little charm. I mean, in the original, he had a lot more charm, he had a lot more vivacity, and he was likable. This one, he just comes off as annoying, and especially when it comes to his voice actor, which I'll get to him later. So apparently, Frosty may be the more interesting aspect of this TV movie or this direct-to-video movie, but there's just nothing to him. There's literally nothing to him other than he tries to be as jovial and funny as possible, but he just comes off as annoying. So overall, I am really not impressed with the cast of characters. They're pretty much lifeless, bland, and at worst, they tend to grate on my nerves and tend to annoy me. Now, the voice actors, oh my goodness. I feel like these people have wasted their time and talent just to be in this thing. I mean, you have the greats like Burt freaking Reynolds doing the narrator's part. And especially with a twist ending that happened after this whole thing. Don't remind me about that. It was just too stupid to endure. But to his credit, I do enjoy Burt Reynolds as a narrator. But he's just there. He's just pretty much playing himself. And it's like he didn't really add a lot of vivacity to his role in comparison with the likes of his predecessors like Jimmy Durant and Andy Griffith. I mean, at least he's slightly better than Jonathan Winters. I'll give him credit for that, but here, I just didn't really feel swayed by him. And his singing of Frosty the Snowman wasn't really that great. But then you have the other voice actors and actresses like Kath Soucie, Greta Lyle, Candy Milo, Tara Strong, and even Vernie Watson Johnson. Well, they do good jobs in their roles, and even Jeannie Elias, but I've heard them in much better, more fleshed out roles, and this isn't their finest. And even the likes of Tom Kenny, who also voiced Mr. Tinkerton, and even Larry Miller. Not really their best performances. In fact, Tom Kenny as Mr. Tinkerton really got on my nerves, especially with Larry Miller as Principal Pankley, but with Bill Fagerback as Frosty the Snowman, okay, it's not too bad of a casting choice, except he almost sounds like Patrick, or excuse me, he does sound like Patrick. He's pretty much Patrick 2.0 in this incarnation. Yes, I understand. He tried to emulate that life that Jackie Vernon had, but here he just came off as annoying and rather grating and almost like a Patrick 2.0. In fact, he is pretty much like Patrick 2.0. So the voice acting, even though it's good, it can't really save the film. So, my goodness, was this thing a chore to sit through? This is definitely, well, one of the worst Christmas specials I have seen. Granted, it's also not as bad as Home Alone 4 could ever be, but it's quite on that level. But it manages to be a lot worse than Grandma Got Run Over by a Reindeer, Itsudate My Santa, and even 8 Crazy Nights, and even Abominable Christmas. Okay, yeah, it managed to be a lot worse than that. So, I'm absolutely disappointed with this film. But it also hurts for me to say that the weaknesses and all of the pratfalls of this film are just way too evident, despite the voice acting, and despite the animation, despite the music, that I have no choice but to give it a 0 out of 5. There is nothing to enjoy about this film. If you really want your pure enjoyment of Frosty the Snowman, go watch the original. Well, I'm done with this. I don't ever want to revisit this, and quite frankly, it deserves to be forgotten. However, there are a couple of snowman related media that I've also liked, but obviously they also come from the other side of the pond, and also an upcoming opera live stream. So, stay tuned for my reviews of The Snowman and the Snow Dog, and of course, Hänsel and Gretel, which was shown from the Wiener Staatsoper. So until then, see you later, and thank goodness it was over.